When Dr. Pat Wicklund married fellow psychologist Dean Mitchell, their union was more than just a melding of two great minds.
We both loved camping, we both loved hiking, loved being outdoors. This was the man for me, no question.
It was magic, you know? It was what girls dream about.
But when her husband's dark secret escaped from behind closed doors,
we were appalled, we were angry, we wanted him taken off the street.
The horrific truth traumatized a community and shattered Pat's world.
Felt like, am I crazy? Is he crazy? Is the rest of the world crazy?
When it comes to love and marriage, things aren't always as they seem. Pat Wicklund has always been an ambitious woman who didn't let much stand in her way. So in the fall of 1967, when she decided to pursue a master's degree in psychology, Pat left California for a well-regarded university in Chicago.
I had been teaching school for a while and realized I wasn't happy with that. I was ready for a major change and a major commitment.
What she wasn't ready for was meeting the man of her dreams.
My freshman roommate from college was there, and she says, I've got the greatest guy. You've got to meet this guy. He's perfect for you.
Pat's friend introduced her to Dean Mitchell, a 25-year-old Ivy League graduate getting his PhD in child psychology.
He was one of the top people in his graduating class, and he was smart. I was tired of these guys that I had dated that were just kind of like, well, you want to go get another beer? I wanted somebody I could talk with.
Dean was ambitious, too, with a lifelong dream of developing a treatment center for troubled teens.
And I thought, there's a guy that likes kids. I came from a big family. I wanted a big family. So this was the kind of man I thought for me.
The feeling seemed mutual, and before long, Pat and Dean were inseparable.
We could carry on a great conversation, and we both loved camping, we both loved hiking. He loved tall, skinny blondes, and boy, was I a tall, skinny blonde. So it was like I fit the bill for him, too.
By the spring of 1968, Dean proposed, and only 5 months later, the young couple tied the knot in a large church ceremony just north of San Francisco.
Oh my gosh, she had a white satin dress. She was the beautiful bride, and he was handsome and kind of dignified. We were just so thrilled.
I had the feeling that it was the right man, the right place, the right time in my life, and that felt really, really good.
2 years later, with their degrees in hand, the couple moved to Dean's hometown of Phoenix, Arizona. Almost immediately, Dean landed a job as director of a youth treatment center where he worked with Richard Giesland.
The biggest part of our business was a 10-bed teenage boys facility, and most of the young men were identified as having serious behavioral problems. Dean just had this very insightful way of watching young people behave and listening to them. He was excellent with the kids.
In October of 1972, Pat and Dean welcomed a son of their own, and life for the couple continued to flourish. By the summer of 1975, they each opened their own practice, and Dean's treatment center had become a huge success.
Dean was very well respected. I felt like he was, one of the best therapists and counselors that I'd ever met.
But as their careers took off, Pat soon realized she needed more help at home. Dean suggested they hire kids from the center to do odd jobs around the house.
He says, they can mow the lawn, they can pull the weeds. I said, do it. And so we had a lot of kids that kind of circled through the house, helping us with things.
Pat was impressed with Dean's commitment to the kids. She was thrilled she had married such a dedicated man. But 8 years later, everything she admired about Dean would come crashing down. On the morning of March 25th, 1983, Dean left early for work while Pat slept in. Suddenly, around 7:30 a.m., the phone rang.
I picked up the phone, and there was some man that was crying. And I thought, this is a crank caller.
Pat quickly snapped wide awake when she realized the man sobbing was her own husband.
I said, where are you? What is the matter? And he says, well, I'm in jail. I said, what are you doing in jail? He says, well, I've been arrested. I said, for what?
What Dean said next was the beginning of a nightmare that would send shockwaves through the community and haunt Pat for years to come.
It was so out of the scope of what I ever would have believed him to do, that it was like, he's crazy.
In the spring of 1975, 8 years before the phone call that would destroy their good life together, Pat and Dean Mitchell were busy parents with thriving careers.
Dean was working at this organization where he was able to help the teens. I went back to school so that I could finish my PhD. Things were going just great.
They were happy in their marriage. They were happy in where they were living. Pat and Dean seemed set.
But in the spring of 1975, one of Dean's patients, a 14-year-old boy named Travis, was facing a crisis.
He was one of the kids that was up helping us in the yard. I started to understand just from talking with him that he was in a foster home and it was going to be impossible for him to stay there much longer. So Dean and I had talked about, well, maybe we could be foster parents. But we started that process with the idea that we could take him into our home.
That spring, Travis moved in, but within a few months, his behavior had started to change.
There were things that started not feeling right. Travis would get angry and pouty and go in and shut the door to his bedroom. He would not be as cordial as he had been with our son.
Then one day, the situation suddenly took a dangerous turn.
I came into his bedroom and he was sitting in the middle of the bed, obviously hallucinating. He had a cigarette in his hand, but he also had set the bed on fire. There was smoke on the bed and he's in this, glassy-eyed stare. It was terrifying.
Pat quickly put out the fire and ran to the phone. She had no choice but to protect her family.
He was a danger to himself as well as to other people. And I went and called the social worker and said, he needs to be in the hospital right now. And he was hospitalized later that afternoon.
That night, when Pat told Dean what had happened, he seemed uncharacteristically upset.
He was kind of angry at the fact that I had picked up the phone and made a unilateral decision. But I was absolutely firm that this child was far too sick for us to have him as a foster child.
Life at home soon returned to normal. And over the next 5 years, Pat earned her PhD and found herself busier and more successful than ever. Meanwhile, it seemed that Dean's ambition was waning.
He was still doing the work with kids that he really, really enjoyed, but it's like things weren't working right. There seemed to be a black cloud over his head.
By the summer of 1981, the situation had not improved. Pat was sure Dean was in more than just a funk.
Dean seemed to be a lot more distant. He stopped grooming himself. His beard he looked like a wild man. He'd go to work and his pants were dirty, and it was like, what is the matter with this guy?
But when Pat tried to talk to Dean, she was quickly shut down.
So it was like minimizing or just disregarding that there was any kind of an issue at all. I couldn't figure out what was going on.
Then one afternoon in the fall of 1982, while Pat was working at her office, she received a most unsettling visit.
I heard this ruckus that was out in the waiting room. So I went out to see what was going on. And here was this woman, and she's yelling and screaming, "Are you Pat?" I had no idea who she was. I said, "Come back to my office and we can talk privately there."
But the woman wouldn't stop. Then suddenly she launched into the most bizarre story about Dean.
She was just screaming and yelling and so out of control. And she says, "Your husband ruined my husband," and she was horrified at what my husband had done.
Dean was a master at hiding what he was doing.
In the fall of 1982, when a stranger suddenly burst into her office, Pat Whitcland was stunned to hear the reason for the woman's angry rant. The woman accused her husband, Dean, of being a child molester.
And she says, "Well, your husband molested my husband and he ruined his life, and how could he have done that?" And I said, what? This doesn't make any sense to me at all.
Even more shocking, the identity of the woman's husband, Travis, the boy Pat and Dean had fostered 7 years before.
It just didn't compute because First of all, she's significantly older than I am. There's a good 20 years between her and Travis. And I said, my experience of him was that he was a very disturbed young man. She said, well, your husband made him disturbed. And so I said, well, I don't know anything about this situation at all. And then she got very angry, picked up her stuff and went flying out of the office. And I'm like, what just happened?
Later that night, still reeling from the news, Pat brought up the incident to Dean.
And he says, I never heard of her. He says, well, she said, that you had molested Travis. He says, I haven't seen that kid in years. I have no idea what's going on.
Pat was not overly concerned.
I thought it was kind of strange, but I just put it off as somebody that just was not really well balanced. Dean worked so hard with so many kids for so long that it was like, this isn't the kind of person that would hurt kids. This is the kind of person that would help them.
But only a few months later, on March 25th, 1983, Pat was suddenly awakened at 7:30 a.m. when a devastating phone call came in. It was Dean, and he was sobbing on the line.
And he says, I've been arrested. I said, you? What for? And he says, well, they said that I was molesting children. And my immediate response was, you? Dean Mitchell? You don't do that.
Dean denied the accusations, and Pat assumed there must be some mistake.
He says, well, there's some people trying to get me. This is just something that happens to other people too. We're easy targets.
Even though their marriage had hit hard times, Pat was ready to support her husband through the ordeal.
And he says, call a friend of ours. He was an attorney. And so I said, okay, I'll call him right now. And so Dean was released later that afternoon. He just absolutely denied doing anything. And I believed him.
But not everyone in the community shared Pat's conviction. Dean was immediately fired from his job.
When we called the center to let them know what was going on, where we knew he was working, they were as shocked as we were.
Eventually, Pat would learn the troubling details behind Dean's arrest. It turned out that his longtime colleague, Richard Giesland, had helped turn him in.
We had a young man in our program who came to myself and our clinical director. I said that he had been meeting Dean, engaging in sexual activity with him. We were shocked. We really never thought Dean would ever do anything to kids. That afternoon, we called the police and called Child Protective Services and started the process going.
Once I was put in touch with the boy, he told me about several incidents in which he was sexually abused by Dean Mitchell. It was a very raw, very painful interview for this boy to go through. I absolutely believed him.
When police conducted interviews at the group homes where Dean had worked, a second boy came forward.
One of the boys corroborated the story of Dean's behavior of sexual activity with boys and that Dean had done some of that with this boy. I felt at the time that I needed to make the arrest to put a stop to Dean working with boys.
But Sergeant Porter knew she didn't have enough for a conviction. As police continued to build their case, the news of Dean's arrest quickly spread through town. Before long, Pat's consulting work began to dry up.
When he lost his job, it was like people weren't coming to me too much anymore either. It was like, stay away from them. So our income just plummeted at that time. I didn't know anything that was going on.
I know there were times where Pat just sat in the middle of her bed and cried and cried.
With Dean out of work, the couple was soon forced to file for bankruptcy. Over the next few months, while Pat did her best to carry on, Dean continued his downward spiral. Even though Pat still believed in his innocence, by summertime, she had had enough.
I told Dean that I wanted a divorce. And he was hurt and angry and furious. And he says, you've got to change your mind. And I said, I'm not going to change my mind. And it was a tough, tough thing to do.
In June 1983, after 15 years of marriage, Pat moved out of their home, legally separating from the husband she'd once loved so dearly.
It's like there's death there, and you don't want to think about that death of your dream.
1 year later, in the spring of 1984, Pat and Dean were still separated. Pat was beginning her new life when an old friend, Karen, called.
The last time I talked to her was when he had been arrested. And she says, let's have lunch. There was some reluctance on her part, and it was like, that's really weird. So I drove across town, and I said, what is the matter?
Karen had something to share, a terrible secret she'd been keeping from Pat for years.
Dean didn't allow people to see this other side of him, this dark secret that he had.
That twit had been lying to me all that time.
If you have a story of marriage gone wrong and would like to appear on this series, go to investigation.discovery.com. In the spring of 1984, Pat listened carefully as her old friend Karen finally revealed a dark secret she'd been keeping for years.
She asked me 24 times, are you sure you're getting a divorce? And every time I said, yes, I am. She says, well, if that's really the case, then I need to tell you something. And she went on to tell me that her son had told her that Dean had molested him.
Karen cried as she explained what had happened to her son almost 2 years before.
She said, listening to him describe his experience of Dean's back rub, it was very obvious that it was a molestation incident. And then he went on to say that that had happened a couple of times. I think this was the hardest thing for me. Karen and I had been such good friends, and it was like, how could you do that to a child like that? And I was so hurt and so angry.
Pat could no longer deny the truth about her husband.
And I said to my attorney, I said, I want full custody of my son. I don't trust this man at all.
As she looked back on Dean's behavior with new eyes, Pat grew sick to her stomach.
It came to mind that maybe that woman that came and talked to me about Travis, maybe she was telling the truth, and I just had no idea that that's what she was really saying.
The more Pat thought about it, the more she realized that Dean spent a lot of time with tall, blonde-haired boys. Boys with the same qualities that once drew Dean to Pat.
Pedophiles seem to be attracted to a particular type of child. Part of my reaction to this whole thing is that that twit had been lying to me all that time.
It seemed Dean's job as a child psychologist provided the perfect cover.
He had a lot of power at the group homes with the boys. If the boys wanted certain privileges, that all had to go through Dean Mitchell.
He knew all the things that people would be looking for, and he thought he could keep it secret.
In the winter of 1985, the families of both boys filed separate civil suits against Dean, the group homes, and even Pat.
Because we were married, I was included in that process. By this time, it was like, I want the divorce over. I just want out of this whole thing.
On March 11th, 1986, Pat and Dean's divorce became final, and Pat received full custody of their son. That summer, Dean settled his civil suits, but was never convicted of child molestation.
These young men could be discredited as witnesses, and I think that's a big piece of why the predators are not caught. So it's infuriating.
I never was able to come up with evidence to strengthen the case against Dean, and I walked away knowing that this man was a pedophile, and there wasn't anything I could do about it.
That same year, Dean lost his psychology license. His days of counseling children were over.
Dean had no profession, he had no family, and essentially no way to make a living. Very shortly after the divorce, he was driving a taxi cab.
Dean never admitted to molesting children.
One of the most difficult things for me is that I never felt like he accepted responsibility. He hurt a number of children. One of the questions that I'm often asked is, well, did he hurt your own child? I've asked my child, and I've asked Dean, and they both said no. And at this point, I've got to take that for face value.
Today, Pat has put this horrible experience behind her and has even found a new love.
Got an offer I couldn't resist from my college sweetheart. He said some version of, come play on my boat and live with me. And I said, oh, okay. And I have really started to have some time for things that I didn't have time for before. So I'm a happy woman.
She moved halfway across the country and started a whole new life for herself.
Despite the move, it took years for the psychologist to heal herself.
I wrote myself out a treatment plan because I knew if I followed my own treatment plan, I would get past being the woman who was married to a child molester and start being a woman who was very proud of herself. And that's the piece that I had lost track of.
Pat wrote a book about her ordeal and discovered that reaching out to other women has been the best medicine of all.
They just need so much help, and it doesn't have to ruin their life. I think the most important thing is that it's not what happens to you, but what you do with what happens that makes a difference.
As a detective, John Pomeroy considered himself an excellent judge of character. So when he met Tina Hambleton, a devout Christian, he thought he'd found the perfect girl.
I wanted to marry her and be with her forever.
John did adore her a lot. He was in great love with Tina.
But when the demons from Tina's past resurfaced,
it was shocking for everyone that knew the both of them.
John suddenly found himself in the stakeout of a lifetime.
So I just sat in a chair facing the door with a shotgun and a couple of handguns, waiting for somebody.
When it comes to love and marriage, things aren't always as they seem. Growing up in a strict Roman Catholic family, John Pomeroy always wanted to help others.
I toured a seminary and considered becoming a priest. Before college, I started dating, and I realized I couldn't be a priest because I was interested in girls.
So at age 24, living in Covina, California, John put his philanthropy to work in another way.
I was a house parent at a home for kids who are orphaned. I loved it a lot.
John enjoyed the work, especially when an attractive woman named Tina Hambleton joined the team in the fall of 1987.
The first time I saw Tina, I thought, oh, she's attractive. And I wonder who that is.
John was instantly smitten, so he mustered up the courage to ask Tina out. But he was quickly shot down.
Tina told me that she wouldn't date me because we weren't of the same faith. I was Catholic, and she was a born-again Christian, and she was only going to date somebody who was a born-again Christian. At that point, I realized, okay, we're just going to be friends.
Soon their friendship grew, and Tina confided in John about her troubled past.
Tina told me that she had been a drug addict until about 3 years before we met. I thought, that's interesting. I've never known anybody who's used drugs like that.
Tina was very open about her past because she shared it as a testimony to other women and how she had overcome those things.
A true believer in second chances, John was inspired by Tina's transformation and curious about the church she attended.
I had begun to become restless in my faith as a Catholic, and she told me about her church. She invited me to some young adult meetings.
John was moved by the ministry, and on Easter Sunday of 1988, he became a member of Tina's church. Suddenly, Tina began to look at John Pomeroy in a different light.
She began to look at me as a person that could be dated.
But Tina's life as a devout Christian included some ground rules that she told John she wouldn't break.
Tina always said from her past she did not like the use of alcohol or pain medications. So she was really opposed to those kind of things.
She said we could drink no alcohol, we could have no sex before marriage. But I saw the spiritual value to these rules, so I didn't fight them.
John respected Tina's wishes and knew she was the right girl for him. A A year later, the couple was married at their church in Whittier, California.
When we were saying our vows, this promise to each other and to God, it was very, very important to me. I was making a commitment for the rest of my life.
Almost immediately, their lives together took off. John became a police officer in Pomona, and Tina became pregnant right away.
We didn't have a normal honeymoon stage. It was get married, go to work at this intense job, and get ready for a baby to come.
When their son Michael was born in 1990, Tina quit her job to become a full-time mom. And John had a new home built for the family.
I was very happy being a father and a husband. I had this beautiful wife who is a good Christian woman.
But 13 years into their marriage, it seemed that Tina had found another calling. And before long, their good life together would crumble. On the morning of May 28, 2002, John's cell phone rang while he was at work.
This woman called and told me that she knew my wife and she knew my kids. I didn't recognize her voice.
John continued to listen as the mysterious woman told him something that would send him running for his life.
And she said that somebody was trying to kill me. And I was shocked.
Tina had gone so far down, so fast.
In the winter of 1995, 7 years before a dire phone call would have Detective John Pomeroy fearing for his life, he and his wife Tina welcomed the birth of their second son, Brandon.
Tina, the boys and I were very close. We would go on vacations, usually to coastline destinations, Long Beach, San Diego, Newport Beach. We did a lot of stuff together.
They had everything that a family could need and want. They were role modeling their marriage to other couples.
But by the summer of 2000, 11 years into their marriage, John began to notice troubling changes in Tina's behavior.
I saw Tina being more irritable. She seemed to be always angry with me, and her personality was changing.
Tina started to take a little bit of a turn. A lot of depression started to set in. It seemed like she was just there, but not there most of the time.
Sometimes she would leave and be gone till 3 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning. And my dad was the one who was there helping take care of us and put us to bed. It was weird.
I would always ask her where she was going, and she would just tell me it was none of my business. I really didn't know what I could do to stop it.
And around that time, according to John, their money was quickly disappearing.
I would go to the supermarket and there was no money in my account.
By the winter of 2000, the situation hadn't improved. John had no choice but to file for bankruptcy. He had no idea what to do next. And by the following year, he saw yet another disturbing side to his wife.
She would occasionally slap me or hit me. My father taught me never to raise a hand to a woman, and I just took the hits.
Tina's actions made one thing clear to John.
I suspected that she was using illegal drugs. There were some strange behaviors that were going on that I couldn't explain, and she was beginning to lose weight.
As a good Christian, John did what he could to hang on to his marriage. He moved out of their bedroom into their home office and pleaded with Tina to get the help it appeared she needed.
I asked her to go to the rehab facility where she first got cleaned on drugs, and she just kept telling me no. She didn't have a problem.
He was trying to keep his family together, and that was his goal and his focus. But Tina was not going to let that happen.
In the summer of 2001, Tina took a job as a counselor at a drug education program for teens. Good friend Rhonda Morkin founded the program and hired Tina.
So Tina came to me at that time and asked, if there was any way she could get paid. There were many problems that they were having, so they needed the money. So I said, well, come on, I can hire you on part-time.
John hoped her new job was a sign that Tina was on the road to recovery. But he couldn't have been more wrong. In July 2001, Tina and John got into a heated argument.
I don't recall what it was, but Tina started arguing with me. She hit me in front of the kids. I mean, it was like a light switch for me. I realized I need to get out. I need to get out of this marriage.
Devastated, John moved out of the house and into the basement of the Pomona police station.
I didn't feel like I could confide to anybody what was going on. I was ashamed as a man, as a police officer, to admit that I was a victim of physical violence, domestic violence.
With no legal right to take their children, John vowed to return for them as soon as he could.
I felt terrible about leaving my boys. I felt like I was abandoning them. I couldn't tell them the history of the violence.
I don't want to say I felt like my dad abandoned me, but it was very easily put to me from my mother that my dad had just up and left, and he didn't care about us.
I thought maybe Tina would think about the kids because there wouldn't be me there to keep everything together, and that she might get her life back in order.
But it wasn't meant to be. Tina's destructive behavior was about to reach a whole new level.
I was in shock. I said, "You have got to be kidding me."
I couldn't believe that she would go to that extreme. It's just unbelievable.
In the summer of 2001, John Pomeroy moved out of his house with the hope that his wife Tina would quickly come to her senses.
I thought that I was enabling her to remain irresponsible, and that if I left, that she might snap out of it and get her act together.
But within weeks, Tina was fired from the drug education program where she worked.
She started to not show up for work. She would come to me, she wanted to borrow money. We had several talks with her about her behaviors during that time. And I saw the change in Tina was not the Tina that I knew at all. So it was time for us to let her go.
John saw no end in sight to his wife's downward spiral. On September 11th, 2001, he filed for divorce and joint custody of their 2 boys.
I knew that there was no going back to her, that there is no way that our marriage would ever be reconciled. I knew it was over.
By April of 2002, John moved into his own apartment, but he was worried about the welfare of their children.
The boys would tell me that there was no electricity at the house. There was no running water at the house. I was really angry that she was exposing our boys to that environment.
At a certain point, you look at the house and you say, there's nothing here that's conducive to a good upbringing.
To make matters worse, John suspected that Tina was hanging around members of a notorious biker gang who lived down the street from their home.
The boys started telling me about certain people who were coming to the house, and we knew that they were members of a motorcycle gang.
I knew a lot about all the gangs in the area. They were into drugs, crime, sexual assaults, I mean, everything that you can think of.
I had already decided that I wanted to get custody of the boys, but that ramped it up for me.
That May, John was awarded temporary custody of his children that would become final within a month.
All I wanted was the boys. I told her that she could have the house, she could have all the property in the house, that I would pay spousal support, and that I would even include child support if the boys could just live with me.
But Tina had another arrangement in mind. On the morning of May 28, 2002, John was at his desk at work when he received a strange call from an unknown woman. The woman told John she knew Tina and their boys, and then she dropped a bombshell.
She told me that Tina was trying to hire a hitman to kill me. I was totally shocked. I never thought that she'd go that far. And I realized that she could be giving me evidence of a crime. I had a tape recorder attached to my phone. So I turned on the tape recorder and I began interviewing her the way I would interview any other witness to a crime.
As John recorded the conversation, the woman informed him that she was related to a member of the biker gang near their home.
So she told me Tina was hoping that this woman could get them to kill me.
The woman declined and never told the other gang members. Instead, she called John. She agreed to give a formal statement and help police with the investigation in any way she could.
So I went to my supervisors. I gave them the tape recording. Everything that this woman said was verifiable information.
With the help of the informant, the sheriff's office in San Bernardino County, where Tina lived, immediately set up a sting operation to catch her in the act.
The undercover detectives came up with a plan of how to use this woman to arrange a meeting with Tina and convince Tina that these undercover detectives were a hitman and his partner.
Meanwhile, John and his kids were quickly moved to an undisclosed location.
One day my dad comes to me and he says, you know, we're gonna go on a little short mini vacation and we're gonna stay at a hotel for a few days. It's gonna be fun.
We went into hiding and I had to tell the boys that we were playing a game for my job. I had lied to my boys.
All the while, John had no idea if Tina had already hired someone else to kill him. He was taking no chances.
I stayed awake all night long, worried that somebody was going to try and break down the door and come in to hurt me. So I just sat in a chair facing the door with a shotgun and a couple of handguns, waiting for somebody.
If you have a story of marriage gone wrong and would like to appear on this series, go to investigation.discovery.com. On May 28, 2002, after learning that his wife of 13 years was trying to hire a hitman to kill him, John Pomeroy was hiding out at a safe house with his sons.
I was sitting in a chair, facing the front door with a shotgun. I was prepared to shoot it out if I had to.
The following afternoon, police sent 2 undercover detectives posing as members of the biker gang to meet with Tina Pomeroy.
San Bernardino Sheriff's Department had an undercover officer go in. He wore a wire and got this recorded on 2 different occasions where Tina asked this person, which was an undercover deputy, to kill John, and she even told him that John was a Pomona police officer.
She agreed to pay them $2,500, and she was going to make a drug run for them. She was also going to provide the gun that was going to be used to kill me.
But her plan was foiled when later that day, the same 2 detectives arrested Tina and charged her with solicitation to commit murder.
I felt relieved that she was off the streets and that she wouldn't be able to continue through with her plan. I think Tina wanted me dead because if you're a police officer and you're murdered in the line of duty, there's a substantial amount of insurance money that goes to the beneficiary, and she was the beneficiary. Tina would also get the boys full time.
Yeah, I was just very angry and let down by my mom. I felt like she really betrayed not only my father, but, myself, Brandon.
On January 7th, 2003, Tina pleaded guilty and was given a 3-year sentence. She served 22 months in prison and was released in the winter of 2004.
That was nothing for what she had planned and what she was going to carry out. I think she should have got at least 10 years. I mean, she honestly deserved that time.
On June 3rd, 2004, John and Tina's divorce became final. But a loophole in the California divorce laws meant that Tina was still entitled to half of John's assets and pension, totaling almost $70,000.
It's just a slap in the face that this woman was entitled to any money at all.
I thought this was absolutely ludicrous for her to get half of his retirement and half of his deferred compensation money. And anything else that he had, she gets half of everything. That was completely wrong.
Furious, John went to lawmakers to get even.
I went to my local assemblyman. I wrote him a letter talking about the situation and why I believed the law needed to be changed.
Following her release, Tina was arrested for theft, a DUI, and drug possession. So in 2006, the courts gave John and his 2 boys a restraining order against her for 5 years.
It was my belief that because Tina's behavior with drugs was back, and knowing what her state of mind was, I felt that there was probably more of a danger to my family than before.
According to John, Tina has never once apologized or shown remorse for what she did.
My mom would never admit to actually anything. She would only say, I am sorry for being away. That's what you're sorry for. You're not sorry for your actions. You're not sorry that you tried to do something totally heinous towards my father. And it was very upsetting.
In July of 2010, John finally succeeded in getting the California divorce law changed. The Hitman Bill was signed and went into effect on January 1st, 2011. But John did not get reimbursed for what he had already paid to Tina.
The satisfaction from getting the law changed was not about getting anything for me. It was about preventing this kind of trauma from happening to anybody else in the future.
Today, John is still a detective and is closer than ever to his 2 boys.
They've grown up a lot through this. Michael's 21, he's going to college. Brandon's 16, he's playing ball in high school. He's loving his teenage years.
My father could have gone completely downhill after the whole situation with my mom, but yet he didn't. He became something more than just a victim of my mom. He's become stronger.
Through his faith, John has been able to forgive Tina for what she did, but he will never forget.
I don't believe it's our role on earth to forgive and forget. It's our job to forgive and live more wisely.
John credits therapy with helping him regain his life and continue raising his 2 sons.
This experience helped me to focus on what's really important, and what's really important is not things, it's people. I've got a better life than I ever had before. So I'm a very blessed man.
It starts with a sound nobody remembers clearly anymore, just a dull metallic echo in the early morning, a noise that didn't belong in a quiet California suburb in the fall of 1996, a sound that would later be described as a door slamming, or maybe a trunk closing, or maybe something else entirely, something heavier, something final. Because by the time the sun rose over the rows of identical houses and trimmed lawns, a woman was gone, and nothing in the neighborhood looked disturbed enough to explain it. No shattered glass, no screaming witnesses, no blood on the pavement, just a driveway still damp with sprinkler water and a car that never left for work. Her name was spoken softly at first, then louder, then constantly, until it became a headline and then a whisper again, one of those names that sticks to a year like a stain, the kind of name detectives keep in the back of their minds long after the files are boxed and shelved, because this wasn't supposed to happen here. Not in a place where people left doors unlocked and waved at each other every morning. Not in a community that believed crime was something that happened somewhere else on the news in big cities far away. The house was neat, almost aggressively normal, the kind of place real estate agents love, beige walls, framed family photos, a kitchen counter wiped clean, no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no obvious panic frozen in place. And that was the first problem. Because disappearances without chaos are the hardest ones to explain. The hardest ones to sell to a public that wants villains who kick doors in and leave messes behind. Not ghosts who slip through routine like they were never there at all. Investigators moved room to room, slow, methodical, cataloging absence, the missing purse, the missing jacket, the untouched coffee cup by the sink, still ringed at the bottom. As if it had been set down with the intention of coming back, and outside, neighbors gathered in clusters, arms crossed, voices low, already beginning the ritual of disbelief, the mental math of distance and time. The quiet reassurances that nothing like this could happen to them, even as patrol cars lined the street, and the word missing began its transformation into something heavier. Within hours, the story hardened into a narrative, as these stories always do, last seen the night before. No known enemies, stable job, stable life, loving family. The phrases stacked neatly on top of one another like bricks in a wall designed to keep fear out. But fear seeps through cracks, and by nightfall, helicopters circled overhead. Search dogs traced confused loops through nearby fields, and flyers were already being printed. Her face captured in a photograph taken years earlier. Smiling, unaware of the role it would one day play. Tips flooded in fast and then slowed to a trickle. The usual flood of maybes and what-ifs. A strange car parked on the street. A man seen walking too slowly. A noise heard but not quite remembered. Every memory suddenly sharpened by guilt. Because everyone had seen something or thought they had, and no one had thought it mattered at the time, and detectives listened, nodded, wrote it all down, knowing that somewhere in the noise there might be a thread worth pulling, or there might be nothing. At all. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and the case began to cool in the way only unresolved cases do, not with a single moment of failure, but with 1,000 tiny setbacks, lab results that came back inconclusive, witnesses who recanted or drifted away, leads that led to other counties, other states, other dead ends, until the investigation existed mostly in file cabinets and late-night conversations, the kind held over cold coffee and dim desk lamps, when the rest of the department had already gone home. There was DNA, that much was certain, collected carefully, sealed, logged, treated like a promise. But in 1996, DNA was still a door half open, powerful but limited, only as good as the databases it could search, and her genetic profile sat there year after year, silent, unmatched, a voice screaming into a void that wasn't ready to listen yet, and as technology marched forward, the case stayed behind. Frozen in time, labeled in thick black marker, cold case, 2 words that sound clinical but feel like a verdict. The community changed around it, new families moved in, kids grew up and left, houses were remodeled, repainted, sold, and resold. But the story lingered, resurfacing every anniversary, every time a reporter needed a reminder of unresolved evil, every time someone asked why it had never been solved, why no one had been held accountable, why a woman could vanish so completely and leave behind nothing but questions. Detectives retired, evidence was transferred, new investigators inherited the file like a curse and a challenge wrapped into one, flipping through yellowing reports, listening to old interview tapes, trying to hear something their predecessors had missed, a hesitation in a voice, a contradiction overlooked, a name written once and never followed up. Because cold cases don't die, they wait, patient and unforgiving, demanding attention long after the world has moved on. And then, years later, the headlines would claim resolution, would shout about breakthroughs and stunning arrests, would promise closure delivered by science and persistence. But inside the file, inside the memories of those who worked it, the truth remained tangled, a case that refused to stay buried, a disappearance that never quite explained itself, a silence that stretched from 1996 into the present, thick and unbroken, reminding everyone involved that some stories don't end cleanly, no matter how badly we want them to. Because somewhere between the neat house, the empty driveway, the evidence sealed in plastic, and the years lost to time, something essential was missing. Not just a person, but the moment that explained everything, the single detail that would make it all make sense. And without it, the case remained what it had always been at its core, a mystery that resisted narrative, resisted justice, and lingered like a shadow over a community that still remembered the morning it realized safety was an illusion. The file doesn't announce itself when it's opened again years later. There's no dramatic cue, no swell of music, just the soft scrape of paper against paper and the quiet weight of a case that refuses to stay still. Because the deeper investigators went, the more the timeline began to bend, stretching and warping under scrutiny, revealing gaps that had been invisible when everything was still fresh, when urgency masked uncertainty and speed replaced doubt. The night she vanished was reconstructed so many times it became a kind of shared hallucination. Each version slightly different depending on who was telling it. A neighbor recalling porch lights flicking on and off. A coworker insisting on a late phone call that may or may not have happened. A family member replaying the last goodbye with microscopic precision. Searching for a crack in the memory where warning might have lived. Because hindsight has a way of convincing us that tragedy always leaves clues, even when it doesn't. Phone records were examined, then re-examined, numbers circled in red, timestamps compared against statements, a missed call here, a voicemail deleted there, nothing explosive, nothing clean enough to hang a theory on, just the slow realization that routine is the perfect camouflage, that a life lived predictably leaves very little behind when it's interrupted. and investigators began to wonder if that predictability had been used against her. They walked the route again, the short drive from home to the main road, the familiar turns she could have taken with her eyes closed, noting how easy it would have been for someone to follow unnoticed, how a car pulling alongside at the right moment might not have raised alarm, how trust, especially in familiar places, is often automatic and unguarded, and that thought sat heavy in the room when they discussed suspects, because the absence of forced entry didn't suggest randomness, it suggested access. Names came and went: co-workers, neighbors, acquaintances, people who lived close enough to observe patterns without drawing attention, and each interview followed the same rhythm: polite questions, measured answers, long pauses filled with the hum of fluorescent lights, everyone insisting on normalcy, on innocence, on routine, while detectives listened for the smallest discordant note, the half-second hesitation that might betray something rehearsed. A witness emerged briefly, like a flare in the dark, claiming to have seen a vehicle idling near the house that night, description vague, color uncertain, memory already eroding under pressure. And for a moment the case seemed to lean forward, momentum gathering, composite sketches circulated, patrols increased, but the lead dissolved as quickly as it formed, another shape glimpsed in shadow, another promise that couldn't survive daylight. The DNA remained the quiet constant, sealed and catalogued, a silent witness waiting for a future that didn't yet exist, and in meetings it was spoken about with cautious optimism, as if saying its potential too loudly might jinx it. Because back then, science was a hopeful footnote, not a headline, and databases were thin, fragmented, unable to speak to one another, leaving her profile stranded, unmatched. A message without a receiver. Pressure mounted from above, from media, from a public that wanted answers fast and clean, and detectives felt the familiar squeeze, the unspoken expectation that effort should equal outcome, that enough hours and enough manpower could force the truth to surface. But cases like this don't respond to pressure. They resist it, folding inward, and as months slipped by, the investigation slowed, not because it mattered less, but because it demanded resources that were always being pulled elsewhere, toward crimes with bodies and witnesses and suspects who could be named. Rumors filled the vacuum, as they always do, whispers of affairs, of secret debts, of plans to leave town, each one briefly inflaming speculation before collapsing under scrutiny. And with every rumor debunked, the case grew heavier, not lighter, because uncertainty is cumulative, it stacks layer upon layer, until the original facts are almost obscured by the sediment of what-ifs. Her family lived inside that uncertainty, measuring time not in years but in unanswered questions, learning the language of investigations by necessity, understanding what it meant when a detective said there was nothing new, and hearing instead that there was nothing solid enough to share, nothing that could bring relief or finality, just the ongoing ache of absence, sharpened by anniversaries and news segments that promised progress and delivered none. Inside the department, the case became a reference point, a quiet challenge passed from one shift to the next, from one generation of detectives to another, each convinced they might be the one to spot the overlooked detail, the misfiled report, the lead dismissed too quickly. Because cold cases attract a particular kind of determination, the kind that believes time can be reversed if you stare hard enough at the past. They did stare at photographs of the house, of the street, of her smile frozen in time, at evidence logs listing items collected and items missing, at interview transcripts annotated with notes written in different handwriting as the years went by, and slowly, subtly, a pattern of absence emerged, not a smoking gun, but a sense that whatever happened had been clean, efficient, intentional, leaving behind just enough to suggest violence without confirming it, just enough to haunt without explaining. When technology advanced, the file was pulled again, dusted off, evidence sent back to the lab with renewed hope. And for a brief moment, it felt like the case inhaled, as if preparing to speak at last. But the results were familiar, partial, inconclusive, DNA still unmatched, still waiting, and the disappointment was sharper this time. Because expectations had been raised by headlines and television shows that taught the public to expect miracles from microscopes and databases. The term cold case settled in officially then, not as an admission of failure, but as a classification, a category that acknowledged persistence without promising resolution. And that label carried weight. It altered how the case was discussed, how it was funded, how it lived in the minds of those tasked with solving it. Because cold cases don't generate urgency, they generate endurance, a slow-burning commitment to remember. Years passed, and with them came changes that couldn't be logged in evidence sheets, detectives aging out of the job, witnesses moving or dying, memories softening at the edges, the past becoming less accessible with every passing season, and still the disappearance resisted explanation. A story without a final act, a question mark anchored stubbornly in 1996. And yet, every so often, usually late at night, someone would pull the file again, flip through the pages, and feel that familiar prickle at the back of the neck, the sense that something was off, that the case wasn't unfinished because it was unsolvable, but because it was waiting for the right moment, the right connection, the right listener, and that belief, fragile and stubborn, kept it alive, kept it breathing in the quiet spaces between headlines, where mysteries don't fade, they linger. Time does something strange to unsolved cases. It doesn't simply pass, it rearranges them, shifting emphasis, erasing urgency, amplifying doubt, until what once felt immediate becomes abstract, and what once seemed insignificant starts to glow with new importance. And that is exactly what happened when investigators began to look again at the people, not as they were in 1996, but as they had become in the years that followed. Because lives don't freeze when a case goes cold, they move on. Sometimes loudly, sometimes quietly, and those movements leave traces, divorces, relocations, career changes, sudden disappearances of their own. And when detectives revisited old names with fresh eyes, they weren't just rereading statements, they were comparing trajectories, asking who had benefited from silence, who had managed to reinvent themselves while a woman's life remained permanently paused. One name surfaced more often than the others, not because of evidence, but because of proximity, the kind that rarely raises alarms until it's viewed in retrospect, someone who knew her routine, who existed close enough to be invisible, whose presence wouldn't have triggered fear or resistance. And yet every time that name came up, the paper trail dissolved into ambiguity, alibis that couldn't be disproven, timelines that flexed just enough to accommodate innocence. Investigators returned to old interview tapes, listening not for what was said, but for how it was said, the rhythm of speech, the places where voices tightened or loosened. And it was unsettling how ordinary they all sounded, how calm, how cooperative, because monsters, if they exist, rarely announce themselves, they blend, they borrow normalcy, and that realization sat heavy in the room as the tapes played on loop. There was a moment, buried deep in the file, that began to stand out, a minor inconsistency noted and dismissed in the first week, a discrepancy so small it had seemed irrelevant at the time, a reported sighting that didn't align perfectly with another witness's account, off by minutes, maybe seconds, and initially that kind of mismatch had been expected. Memory under stress is unreliable, but years later, that tiny fracture looked different, less like confusion and more like interference. The street was revisited, not physically at first, but through maps and aerial photos, old zoning plans, property records, the kind of slow, meticulous work that doesn't make headlines, and what emerged was a subtle shift in perspective. A realization that sightlines had changed over the years, that trees had grown, fences had been added, streetlights replaced, and that in 1996, visibility had been different. Clearer in some places, darker in others, creating pockets of shadow where actions could be concealed without effort. That possibility reopened questions about the timeline, about when she was last truly seen, not assumed to be seen, and that distinction mattered. Because assumptions harden into facts if they're not challenged early. And once they do, entire theories can be built on foundations that were never stable to begin with. Detectives began to suspect that the window of opportunity was narrower than originally believed, that whatever happened unfolded quickly, decisively, leaving no room for chaos or witnesses. And that kind of efficiency suggested planning, not spontaneity, intention rather than impulse, and that reframed everything, from the lack of struggle to the absence of noise, from the missing items to the untouched ones. They asked themselves whether the disappearance had been the goal from the beginning, or merely a means to an end. And without a body, without a crime scene that declared itself, the case hovered in a gray zone, legally and emotionally, a place where certainty goes to erode, and that erosion was mirrored in the community, which had long since stopped expecting answers but never quite stopped hoping for them. Media attention flared briefly whenever a new angle emerged, the familiar cycle of sensational headlines and cautious statements, reporters eager for closure, investigators careful not to promise what they couldn't deliver, and each time, the public leaned in, waiting for the moment when the mystery would finally resolve into something comprehensible, something that could be named and archived and left behind. But comprehension never arrived, only more complexity, more questions layered on top of old ones. And the case began to feel less like a puzzle and more like a void something that absorbed effort without reflecting it back. And still, the DNA waited, silent but potent, a reminder that truth might exist in microscopic form, even if it remained inaccessible. Advances in forensic science brought renewed interest, genealogical databases expanding, algorithms growing more sophisticated, and suddenly, the idea of a match no longer felt like science fiction. But with that hope came ethical debates, legal barriers, the slow grind of approvals and protocols, because progress in cold cases is never just about technology, it's about permission, about what society is willing to trade for answers. When evidence was retested, the process was almost ceremonial, gloves snapped on, seals checked and rechecked, chain of custody documents reviewed like sacred texts, and for weeks, anticipation hung in the air, a collective holding of breath. But when results came back, they were maddeningly familiar, partial profiles, possible connections that dissolved under scrutiny. Another step forward that felt indistinguishable from standing still. Inside the department, frustration simmered, not loud, but persistent, because every unsolved case is also a mirror, reflecting limitations, missed chances, the unforgiving reality that not all wrongs can be righted. And that knowledge wears on investigators in ways that don't show up in reports or performance reviews. The family watched from the outside, learning to read between the lines of official updates, understanding that silence often meant work was happening, just not work that could be shared, and they lived in a constant state of suspended grief, unable to mourn fully, unable to hope freely, trapped between past and present, between what was known and what might never be. As years stacked into decades, the case became part of the department's institutional memory, a story told to new recruits, a reminder of why details matter, why assumptions are dangerous, why patience is essential, and why some cases refuse to be solved not because of lack of effort, but because the truth has been buried too deeply, scattered too far, obscured by time and human fallibility. And still, the question lingered, not loudly, but insistently, a low-frequency hum beneath every review, every meeting, every late-night revisit of the file. What if the answer had been there all along, hiding in plain sight, overlooked because it didn't fit the narrative everyone expected? Because it was too ordinary, too quiet, too close to home. That thought followed investigators out of the office and into their personal lives, into moments of stillness when the mind wanders back to unresolved things. And in those moments, the case felt less like a professional challenge and more like a shared burden. A reminder that some stories resist endings, not out of malice, but because reality is rarely as tidy as we want it to be. The disappearance remained unyielding, a fixed point in time around which everything else continued to orbit, and as long as it remained unresolved, it cast a shadow not just over the past, but over every attempt to understand it, a shadow that lengthened with each passing year, stretching forward, waiting. By the time the case crossed the 20-year mark, it had stopped feeling like an investigation and started feeling like a presence, something that occupied space without ever fully revealing itself, something you could sense even when no one was talking about it. Because unresolved violence has a way of embedding itself into institutions, into communities, into the people who carry it forward without realizing how much weight it adds to every step. The evidence room held what little the past had given up, boxes labeled in fading ink, seals yellowed with age, items that had once felt urgent now handled with almost reverent care, because mistakes made late in a cold case are unforgivable, and everyone knew it. Every technician, every detective, every supervisor signing off on another round of testing, another attempt to coax meaning from fragments. What troubled investigators most wasn't what they had, but what they didn't, the missing connective tissue between facts, the moment when choice turned into action. Because without that, motive remained speculative, and speculation, no matter how informed, has a way of collapsing under scrutiny, especially in a case that had already survived decades of it. There were theories, of course, always theories, some whispered, some written, some dismissed and later reconsidered. Theories that leaned toward the domestic, the familiar, the statistically probable, and others that veered into darker territory, strangers passing through, opportunistic violence, crimes of chance, and each theory had its champions and its critics. Arguments made quietly in offices and more heatedly in closed-door meetings, because when certainty is absent, belief fills the gap. One theory suggested restraint without struggle, a scenario where fear wasn't immediate, where compliance felt safer than resistance. And that idea unsettled everyone who considered it, because it implied a manipulation of trust, a moment when the wrong choice didn't feel wrong at all, just ordinary, just another step in a routine day that suddenly fractured. Another theory fixated on timing, on how narrow the window truly was, how little margin for error the perpetrator would have had, and that led back, inevitably, to the idea of familiarity, of someone who didn't need to improvise, who already knew when and where, who understood the rhythms of the house and the street well enough to move through them without leaving ripples. Investigators revisited old surveillance possibilities, grainy footage from businesses that no longer existed, tapes long since recorded over or discarded, and the absence of visual confirmation felt like another theft by time. Another reminder that the world of 1996 had not been built to preserve itself for future scrutiny, that moments vanished then without apology. The community, meanwhile, had learned to live with the unresolved, though not comfortably, and every so often, a reminder would break through the routine. A new detective asking questions, a car parked too long on the street, a rumor of renewed activity, and conversations would stop mid-sentence, eyes flicking toward the house where it began, as if expecting the past to step back into view. For the family, those moments were double-edged, hope-sharpening grief, attention reopening wounds that never fully healed, because every revival of interest carried with it the possibility of answers and the almost inevitable disappointment of none. A cycle that taught them caution, emotional restraint, a guardedness born not of indifference but of survival. Inside the department, the case became a study in endurance, used in training not for its outcome, but for its complexity, for the way it illustrated the limits of certainty, and new detectives listened, absorbing the lesson that some investigations don't reward effort with resolution. That sometimes the best you can do is preserve the truth as faithfully as possible for someone else to find later. That preservation became a mission in itself, digitizing files, cross-referencing reports, ensuring that nothing else would be lost to decay or oversight, because if the case were ever to break open, it would likely do so suddenly, triggered by an external event, a technological leap, a chance confession, something unpredictable, and readiness mattered. When genealogical DNA entered the conversation in earnest, it brought with it both excitement and restraint, the promise of narrowing anonymity into family lines, and the risk of legal challenges, public backlash, ethical debates that could derail progress entirely, and meetings stretched late into the night as officials weighed potential against consequence, aware that one misstep could compromise everything. Test runs were discussed hypothetically, scenarios mapped out on whiteboards, arrows connecting surnames and regions, and for the first time in years, the case felt dynamic again, as if it were shifting, repositioning itself in response to modern pressure. But that movement was subtle, almost deceptive, because motion does not guarantee direction. There were moments of almost near matches that sparked internal alerts before quietly collapsing, genetic similarities that led to families with no connection, branches that ended abruptly, leaving behind only the echo of what might have been, and each disappointment carried a familiar sting, sharper now because expectations had been allowed to rise. Still, the effort continued, fueled not by optimism but by obligation, the understanding that unresolved cases represent unfinished business, not just for victims and families, but for the systems tasked with protecting them, and that accountability doesn't expire simply because time has passed. The detectives closest to the case spoke of it differently now, less like a problem to be solved and more like a story to be honored, careful with facts, restrained in conclusions, committed to accuracy above all else, because distortion, even well-intentioned, would only deepen the injustice. And yet, beneath that restraint, the question persisted, stubborn and corrosive, whether the truth had slipped past them early on, whether a single overlooked moment, a single dismissed detail, had set the case on a trajectory that no amount of later effort could correct, and that question haunted reviews, colored decisions, lingered in the silence after meetings ended. The house still stood, altered but recognizable, a physical anchor to an event that no longer felt real to those who hadn't lived through it, and investigators sometimes drove by, not officially, not on record, just to remind themselves that the case was grounded in reality, that it began in a place that still existed, that the disappearance wasn't abstract, it was spatial, tangible, rooted. As the years accumulated, the case refused to fade into obscurity, not because it was constantly discussed, but because it remained unresolved, a loose thread in a system that prides itself on closure, and that resistance to finality gave it power, the power to unsettle, to provoke, to remind everyone involved that some truths are stubbornly opaque. And in that opacity, the case continued to live, not loudly, not dramatically, but persistently, a quiet challenge stretching across decades, waiting for the moment when coincidence, courage, and circumstance might finally align, or when time itself would render the question unanswerable, leaving behind only the echo of what happened and the certainty that it mattered. By the third decade, the case had shed any illusion of urgency and replaced it with something heavier, a kind of institutional patience that masked exhaustion, because carrying an unanswered question for that long changes how it's held. It becomes less about resolution and more about responsibility, about ensuring that whatever truth existed was not erased by neglect or convenience. New eyes brought new discomfort, younger investigators unburdened by the emotional history of the case, willing to question decisions that had once seemed untouchable. And that willingness stirred tension, not hostility, but a quiet defensiveness, because revisiting old work inevitably feels like an accusation, even when it's framed as progress. They questioned the early assumptions again, not just about suspects, but about categorization, about whether the disappearance had been framed correctly from the start, whether the absence of a body had pushed the case into a procedural limbo that affected how aggressively it was pursued, and that line of inquiry was unsettling, because it suggested that labels can shape outcomes in ways that aren't immediately visible. The timeline was rebuilt from scratch, stripped of inherited conclusions, every data point anchored only to verifiable fact, and what emerged was leaner, more fragile. A narrative full of conditional statements and probability rather than certainty, and that fragility felt closer to the truth than any confident theory that had preceded it. Attention returned to the hours after the disappearance was first noticed, not the moment itself, but the response, who was called when how information moved, where it slowed or distorted, because early hours in missing person cases are decisive, and even small delays can ripple outward, altering trajectories in ways that can't be reversed. Communication logs were scrutinized, radio traffic, dispatch notes, informal conversations reconstructed from memory, and patterns of hesitation emerged, understandable in context, but consequential nonetheless, and acknowledging that didn't assign blame. It acknowledged reality, that systems are made of people, and people act with limited information under pressure. The case also forced uncomfortable conversations about perception, about which disappearances trigger immediate alarm and which are quietly deprioritized, about how assumptions regarding lifestyle, stability, and risk can influence urgency, and those conversations, though abstract on the surface, carried a personal weight for those who had lived with the case from the beginning. Outside the department, the world had changed dramatically, the internet reshaping memory itself, turning old headlines into permanent artifacts, allowing amateur investigators to comb through details, speculate publicly, and sometimes stumble onto overlooked connections. And while most of that attention generated more noise than insight, it also kept the case visible, alive in a way earlier generations couldn't have imagined. That visibility brought both opportunity and risk, tips arriving from strangers who had spent years immersed in the story, some grounded, many not, and detectives had to navigate that influx carefully, open to the possibility of insight while guarding against contamination. Because once speculation enters official channels unchecked, it can distort evidence and compromise objectivity. One tip, arriving decades late, carried a peculiar weight, not because it introduced new facts, but because it reframed old ones. A person recalling a conversation from the 1990s that had seemed meaningless at the time, a casual remark, a fleeting confession masked as a joke, and memory, unreliable as it is, suddenly felt like both a gift and a liability. That recollection couldn't be verified, couldn't be corroborated, but it lingered, echoing through meetings, raising questions about how many moments like that had been lost, dismissed, or forgotten, and whether truth, in this case, might be fragmented across dozens of minds, none of them holding enough on their own to form a complete picture. The DNA, once again, became a focal point, not as a miracle solution, but as an anchor, something objective in a sea of interpretation, and with expanded databases and improved techniques, the possibility of extraction, of inference, of narrowing the field felt more tangible than ever, though still frustratingly out of reach. Requests were made, approvals sought, resources allocated, and the process unfolded slowly, bureaucratically, because progress in cold cases is rarely dramatic. It arrives in increments, measured in forms signed and boxes moved, and patience was the currency everyone had learned to trade in. As the investigation pressed forward, the emotional toll surfaced in quieter ways, investigators expressing fatigue not with the work itself, but with the weight of unresolved obligation, the sense that something essential had been left undone, and that carrying it forward was both a duty and a burden. The family remained present, resilient in ways that defied easy description, participating in updates, offering support, absorbing disappointment with a composure that only long experience can produce. And their presence served as a constant reminder that the case was not an abstraction, not a training exercise, but a human loss with ongoing consequences. Through all of it, the case maintained its hold, refusing to settle into history, resisting closure, and in that resistance, it demanded honesty, not optimism, not certainty, but a commitment to continue asking questions even when answers seemed unlikely, because sometimes the act of asking is all that stands between remembrance and forgetting. And so the investigation moved forward, not toward a clear destination, but along a narrow path defined by diligence and restraint, aware that the truth, if it ever emerged, would likely do so quietly, without fanfare, altering lives not through spectacle, but through the simple, devastating clarity of being known. By now, the case no longer lived in a single place. It existed across servers and backups, across binders scanned into PDFs, across memories carried by people who no longer wore badges. And that diffusion made it both harder and easier to confront. Harder because no single narrative held authority anymore. Easier because nothing was immune to re-examination. What emerged from that re-examination was not a revelation, but a pressure, a sense that the truth, whatever it was, had been compressed by time rather than erased, squeezed into fewer and fewer viable explanations, each one uncomfortable in its own way, each one demanding that investigators accept something they had resisted before. One possibility refused to go away, resurfacing again and again despite the lack of conclusive proof. The idea that the disappearance had been misinterpreted at its core, not in its details but in its nature, that the event had not been chaotic or violent in the traditional sense, but controlled, quiet, almost procedural, and that assumption reframed everything that followed. If that were true, then the lack of witnesses was not a failure of chance, but a feature of design, and the absence of physical struggle was not evidence of consent, but of calculation, and that realization shifted attention away from dramatic suspects and toward subtler ones. People whose lives did not fracture after 1996, people who carried on with an ease that felt, in retrospect, unsettling. Financial records were reviewed again, not because money was thought to be the motive, but because transactions leave patterns and patterns reveal behavior, and while nothing illegal surfaced, there were movements that raised questions, timing that aligned too neatly with opportunity, explanations that were technically plausible but emotionally thin. Relationships were mapped with new precision, not just romantic or familial, but social, professional, incidental, the web of interactions that form around a person without ever announcing themselves as significant. And in that web, proximity became the quiet metric of interest, not guilt, but access. Access, investigators knew, is often mistaken for innocence, familiarity mistaken for safety, and that confusion has derailed countless cases. Because danger rarely presents itself as unfamiliar. It arrives wearing the face of routine, the sound of a known voice, the comfort of expectation. Interviews were conducted again, decades removed from the original event, and the tone was different now, less confrontational, more reflective, because time alters defenses, erodes rehearsed answers, and sometimes reveals contradictions not through pressure, but through fatigue, the slow loosening of narratives repeated too many times. Some people remembered more, others less, memory sharpening or blurring in unpredictable ways, and investigators listened without judgment, aware that truth does not always announce itself as certainty. Sometimes it appears as inconsistency, as a story that shifts just enough to suggest it was never fully stable to begin with. There were moments when silence spoke louder than words, when a pause stretched too long, when an answer arrived too quickly, too smoothly, and those moments were noted, not as proof, but as signals, indicators of where attention should linger, where the ground might be less solid than it appeared. The case also began to intersect with other cases, not through direct evidence, but through thematic resemblance, disappearances that shared structural similarities, timing, location, method, and while none could be formally linked, the comparisons were unsettling, suggesting patterns that transcended geography, patterns that relied on opportunity rather than force. That possibility opened another door. One investigators approached cautiously, the idea that the case was not isolated, that it might be one instance in a series too diffuse to recognize easily, and while that theory offered a kind of explanation, it also multiplied the uncertainty, because patterns without perpetrators are just shapes in the dark. Technology continued to advance, quietly, relentlessly, and with it came new tools for analysis, not just of DNA, but of data itself, algorithms capable of identifying correlations humans miss, systems designed to surface anomalies buried in volume. And the case was fed into those systems, its details reduced to variables, its history translated into code. The results were intriguing but inconclusive, clusters of possibility rather than conclusions, reinforcing what investigators already knew, that the case lived at the intersection of probability and absence, where certainty struggled to take root. Public interest flickered again, sparked by anniversaries, documentaries, podcasts, each retelling the story with varying degrees of fidelity. And while that attention sometimes frustrated those closest to the case, it also served a purpose, keeping the name alive, the details circulating, the possibility of a critical memory surfacing still intact. Tips arrived from unexpected places, a former resident recalling a move timed suspiciously close to the disappearance, a co-worker remembering a tension never reported, a stranger connecting dots across states and years, and each tip was treated with care, not because most would pan out, but because one might. The investigation settled into a rhythm defined not by deadlines, but by readiness, the understanding that breakthroughs in cold cases rarely arrive on schedule. They arrive when conditions align, when technology, memory, and opportunity intersect, and preparation is what allows that moment to be recognized when it comes. Internally, discussions grew more philosophical, less about suspects and more about meaning, about what it meant to pursue truth in a case that resisted resolution, about the balance between hope and honesty, between persistence and acceptance, and those discussions mattered because they shaped how the case would be carried forward. No one wanted to be the person who declared the search over, who closed the book without an ending, and so the case remained open, not as a formality, but as a statement that unresolved does not mean forgotten, that absence does not erase obligation. The house, the street, the neighborhood, all continued their quiet existence, unaware of the weight they carried, and investigators understood now that the disappearance was not just an event, it was a fracture in time, a point at which certainty failed, and everything that followed unfolded in its shadow. As part 6 of the story folded into the larger whole, nothing resolved, nothing collapsed into clarity, but something did shift, a subtle tightening of focus, a narrowing of possibilities, the sense that the truth, while still hidden, was no longer infinite, that it existed somewhere within a shrinking perimeter of explanation. And that realization, fragile as it was, carried its own kind of tension, because when possibilities narrow, stakes rise, and the closer you get to an answer, the more disruptive that answer becomes, threatening not just to explain the past, but to disturb the present, to force reckonings long deferred, and that knowledge hung over the case like a held breath, waiting. The closer the perimeter seemed to tighten, the quieter the conversations became, not out of secrecy, but out of instinct, because when a cold case begins to feel less abstract, less theoretical, people sense it, even those on the edges, and a subtle caution settles in, the kind that changes how questions are asked and how answers are offered. Investigators noticed at first in interviews, a shift in posture, a recalibration of tone, as if the past, long treated as safely distant, had started to move again, and movement, even the suggestion of it, has consequences because time protects many things, but it also exposes them, and not everyone is prepared for that exposure. The case began to generate discomfort in unexpected places, not outrage, not fear, but unease, the kind that surfaces when routines are disrupted, when people are reminded that history is not as settled as they believed, and that reminder traveled quietly through conversations, through glances, through sudden hesitations where none had existed before. One interview, conducted without fanfare, lingered longer than the rest, not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't, the careful avoidance of certain details, the selective clarity, memories sharp where they benefited the speaker and vague where they did not, and while that pattern alone proved nothing, it resonated with earlier impressions, echoing inconsistencies noted decades earlier and dismissed as stress or confusion. Investigators returned to that echo, tracing it backward through reports and notes, discovering that it had been present all along, faint but persistent, a recurring dissonance that had never risen high enough to dominate the narrative, but had never disappeared either, and suddenly, it felt louder. They revisited the idea of motive, not as a single force, but as a convergence, opportunity intersecting with desire, resentment blending with convenience, because motives are rarely pure, rarely singular, and the absence of overt conflict in her life did not preclude the existence of quieter tensions, the kind that don't announce themselves until it's too late. The environment of the mid-1990s was reconsidered as well, Not nostalgically, but critically, a time before pervasive surveillance, before digital footprints were unavoidable, when anonymity was easier to maintain and records were easier to erase. And that context mattered, because it shaped what was possible, what could be done and remain unseen. Investigators mapped out hypothetical scenarios again, not to sensationalize, but to test plausibility, walking through moments step by step, questioning assumptions at each turn, and what emerged was a chilling simplicity, not a convoluted scheme, but a straightforward sequence of actions requiring only familiarity and timing, nothing dramatic, nothing that would have raised alarms. That simplicity was perhaps the most unsettling aspect, because it suggested that the disappearance didn't hinge on luck, but on predictability, on the reliability of routine, and that realization cast everyday life in a harsher light, reminding everyone involved how vulnerable normalcy can be. The DNA, ever present, ever silent, was finally threaded into genealogical searches with cautious optimism. Parameters set carefully, boundaries respected, and while no definitive match emerged, the process yielded something else, a narrowing of ancestral lines, a rough sketch of possibility, incomplete but suggestive, enough to reorient attention without declaring victory. Those results were discussed in hushed tones, not because they were explosive, but because they were fragile, vulnerable to misinterpretation, and everyone understood the stakes, the danger of overreaching, of forcing conclusions where none yet existed, a mistake that could collapse years of work in an instant. Outside attention intensified briefly, fueled by rumors of progress, and investigators found themselves balancing transparency with restraint, offering reassurance without promising resolution, aware that public expectation, once raised, is difficult to manage, and disappointment can be corrosive not just to morale, but to trust. The family was informed carefully, updates delivered with precision, neither minimizing nor exaggerating developments, and their response was measured, seasoned by years of waiting, hope tempered by experience, gratitude expressed quietly, without illusion, and that composure left a deep impression on everyone present. Within the department, the case prompted reflection, not just about tactics, but about time itself, about how long justice can be deferred before it changes shape, before resolution feels less like restoration and more like revelation, something that answers questions but also creates new ones. There was discussion of legacy, of what it would mean if the case were solved now, after so many years, what truths would surface, whose lives would be disrupted, and whether the cost of knowing might be higher than anyone anticipated, because answers don't exist in isolation, they ripple outward, reshaping narratives long assumed settled. Investigators felt that weight acutely, the understanding that proximity to truth carries responsibility, not just to facts, but to people, to families, to a community that had lived with uncertainty for decades, and that responsibility demanded patience, discipline, and a willingness to move slowly even when the pressure to accelerate was intense. The case file, once a static artifact, now felt dynamic again, its contents shifting in relevance as new connections were tested and old ones reevaluated. And that movement created a sense of momentum that was both energizing and exhausting, because momentum in a cold case is fragile, easily lost, easily overstated. Late nights returned, detectives poring over documents, cross-checking names, revisiting places, not driven by deadline, but by intuition, the sense that something was aligning, not yet clear enough to name, but distinct enough to feel, like a shape emerging from fog. That feeling, elusive and unsettling, followed them out of the office, into quiet moments at home, into thoughts that surfaced unbidden, because unresolved cases have a way of crossing boundaries, of occupying mental space even when they're not being actively worked, and the closer they feel, the harder they are to put down. The disappearance, still unresolved, had begun to exert pressure again, not from the outside, but from within, pressing on assumptions, on narratives, on long-held beliefs, and that pressure suggested a turning point, not necessarily toward resolution, but toward reckoning, a moment when the past demands to be addressed regardless of outcome. And as part 7 of the story settled into place, the case stood at a threshold, balanced between inertia and upheaval, between what was known and what was about to be challenged. And in that balance, tension lived, thick and persistent, waiting for the next shift, the next detail, the next crack in the silence that had held for so long. The threshold did not announce itself with alarms or headlines. It arrived quietly, disguised as procedure, a routine request buried in paperwork, a follow-up that looked ordinary enough to anyone not steeped in the history of the case. And yet the effect was immediate, a subtle tightening in the room when the implications became clear. Because when you circle the same ground for decades, even small shifts feel seismic, and this shift, modest on paper, touched something sensitive, something long protected by time and assumption, and suddenly the past felt less inert, less safely distant. Investigators began to feel resistance, not overt, not confrontational, but perceptible, a slowing of responses, a carefulness that hadn't been there before, as if the idea of resolution, once abstract, had become inconvenient, even threatening, to people who had grown accustomed to its absence. Records requests were met with delays that couldn't be fully explained. Recollections once offered freely became cautious, filtered, and while none of this constituted evidence, it was a change in behavior, and in a case defined by absence, change mattered. The genealogical DNA results, still incomplete, still provisional, had begun to cast a faint outline, not of a person, but of a family network, a loose constellation of names and regions that intersected uncomfortably close to the original geography, and that proximity raised questions no one wanted to voice too loudly. It wasn't confirmation, far from it, but it was direction, and direction after decades of drift carries its own gravity, pulling attention, resources, and scrutiny along with it, whether anyone is ready or not. Investigators moved carefully, aware that premature focus could distort judgment. That tunnel vision had ruined many promising cold cases before this one, and so they proceeded with restraint, testing hypotheses quietly, verifying mundane details before touching anything that might provoke reaction. Backgrounds were re-examined with fresh criteria, not looking for criminal history alone, but for patterns of movement, sudden relocations, unexplained absences, changes that aligned too neatly with the disappearance to be ignored. And while none of those elements proved guilt, together they formed a texture that felt increasingly specific. One individual, long considered peripheral, resurfaced in discussions, not because of new evidence, but because the old evidence now looked different when viewed through the narrowed lens of possibility, details once dismissed as coincidence acquiring weight through accumulation. That reevaluation was uncomfortable, especially for those who remembered the early days of the case, the interviews conducted, the assurances given, the decisions made under pressure, because acknowledging the potential relevance of a long-dismissed figure felt like admitting that time itself had been an accomplice. Interviews resumed, carefully framed, deliberately non-accusatory, designed to gather information without triggering defensiveness. And for the most part, they succeeded, conversations flowing easily enough, memories offered with the practiced cadence of stories told many times before. But beneath that smoothness, investigators detected strange, subtle deviations, a tightening around certain topics, an eagerness to redirect, and those moments were cataloged, not as proof, but as points of interest, places where attention might linger later. The concept of memory, already fragile after so many years, became a central concern, not just what people remembered, but how those memories had been reinforced, reshaped by repetition, by media coverage, by private reflection, until it was impossible to separate original experience from subsequent interpretation. That complexity made the work slower, more deliberate, because every assertion required triangulation, every claim weighed against context. And in that slow movement, tension built, not explosive, but steady, like pressure accumulating behind a sealed door. Externally, speculation intensified, fueled by subtle signals that something was happening, that the case was no longer dormant, and investigators braced for the familiar distortion. The way rumor transforms process into narrative, uncertainty into certainty, and restraint into suspicion. They remained quiet, disciplined, knowing that the most dangerous moment in a cold case is often just before a breakthrough, when excitement outruns evidence and the story begins to write itself prematurely. Inside the department, conversations turned pragmatic, contingency-focused, discussing not just what might be found, but how it would be handled, how information would be released, how the impact on families and community would be managed, because the consequences of resolution, if it came, would be far-reaching. There was also the question no one wanted to ask directly: what if the truth, once surfaced, failed to deliver the closure everyone expected? What if it explained the disappearance, but introduced new uncertainties, new moral ambiguities? Because truth does not always heal, sometimes it only clarifies the wound. The family remained central to these considerations, their endurance shaping the tone of every decision, their long wait a reminder that whatever outcome emerged would arrive late, too late to restore what had been lost, and that knowledge imposed a kind of humility on the process. As investigators pressed forward, they were acutely aware of how little margin for error remained, evidence degraded, memories fragile, legal thresholds high, and the possibility that a single misstep could undo years of careful progress loomed constantly. Yet despite that fragility, there was a sense of inevitability creeping in, not certainty, but momentum, the feeling that the case had reached a point where it could no longer remain static, that it was being compelled forward by forces larger than any individual decision. That feeling manifested in small ways, in the urgency of meetings, in the careful wording of reports, in the instinct to double-check everything, as if the system itself sensed proximity to something consequential. The house, the street, the ordinary geography of the disappearance resurfaced in investigators' minds, not as crime scenes, but as symbols of how easily violence can be absorbed into routine, how quietly lives can diverge from expectation, and that reflection lent a somber gravity to the work. At times, investigators wondered whether the case wanted to be solved, whether some stories resist closure because their power lies in their ambiguity, in the way they unsettle assumptions about safety and predictability. And yet that philosophical question never overrode the practical one: what happened and why? As this phase unfolded, the case felt poised, balanced precariously between revelation and retreat, each new piece of information carrying the potential to tip it in either direction. And that balance was exhausting, emotionally and intellectually, because anticipation is its own form of strain. Still, no one stepped back, no one disengaged, because after decades of silence, the possibility of hearing the truth, however incomplete, exerted a pull that was impossible to ignore. The cold case, long defined by absence, had begun to generate presence, not answers yet, but pressure, expectation, consequence, and that transformation altered everything, changing how the past was viewed and how the future was imagined. And as the investigation moved deeper into this uncertain territory, one reality became clear to everyone involved: that whatever emerged next would not simply close a chapter, it would reopen many others, forcing a reckoning with decisions made long ago and the quiet ways time had allowed them to stand unchallenged. The silence that followed each meeting felt heavier now, not empty, but charged, as if the case itself were listening, waiting, preparing to reveal just enough to ensure it would never be forgotten. What finally shifted was not evidence, not a confession, not a dramatic discovery pulled from the past, but context, the realization that the case had been asking the wrong question for years, not who took her, but how the disappearance had been allowed to look so ordinary, because ordinary is the safest disguise anything can wear. Investigators began to see the early days differently now, the calm reports, the lack of panic, the procedural tone that had settled in too quickly, as if the event had been unconsciously minimized before it was fully understood. And that reframing was unsettling, because it suggested that the disappearance had been absorbed into routine almost immediately, filed under manageable rather than catastrophic. They revisited the initial classification again, the decision points that shaped how resources were deployed, how urgency was communicated, how assumptions hardened into operational reality, and in those early choices, they sensed the quiet power of normalcy, how easily a life can slip through the cracks when nothing looks overtly wrong. That insight forced a deeper examination of the people closest to the moment when concern first arose, not as suspects, but as participants in a system that responds according to cues, and cues in this case had been subtle, misleading, reassuring in the worst possible way. Timelines were synchronized with renewed precision, not just aligning clocks, but aligning perceptions, asking what each person believed was happening at each moment, and the discrepancies were revealing, because belief shapes action, and actions shape outcomes. And when belief is flawed, even well-intentioned responses can miss critical opportunities. One realization emerged slowly, almost reluctantly, the possibility that the disappearance had not immediately registered as a disappearance at all, but as an anomaly to be resolved, a delay to be explained, a deviation that still fit within the bounds of everyday life. And that delay in recognition mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. The investigation had always focused on the act itself, the taking, the vanishing, but now attention lingered on the aftermath, on how the absence was interpreted, on how concern escalated or failed to, and in that space between absence and alarm, something essential may have been lost. This line of thinking was uncomfortable because it implicated no single villain, no singular failure, but a convergence of small, reasonable assumptions that collectively created blind spots, and blind spots are the most dangerous flaws of all, because they don't announce themselves. As these ideas took hold, investigators felt a shift in tone, less urgency to identify a perpetrator and more urgency to understand the system that had allowed the case to drift for so long. And that understanding, while not a substitute for justice, felt necessary, a form of accountability that extended beyond one individual. The genealogical DNA work continued in parallel, quietly, methodically, its slow progress a reminder that science operates on its own timeline, indifferent to narrative pressure. And while no definitive identification emerged, the narrowing continued, the field of possibility contracting in ways that felt both promising and maddening. At the same time, investigators grappled with the reality that even a perfect match might not deliver the clarity everyone expected, because DNA can place a person in proximity, but it cannot explain intention, cannot reconstruct moments, cannot fill in the emotional gaps that define human actions. The case, once imagined as a puzzle with missing pieces, now felt more like a mosaic with fragments worn smooth by time. The image still visible, but softened, edges blurred, details lost. And that metaphor carried weight, because mosaics don't reveal themselves all at once, they require distance and patience. Public narratives, meanwhile, continued to simplify, headlines eager for resolution framing developments as breakthroughs, and investigators felt the familiar tension between process and perception, the need to correct misconceptions without extinguishing hope, a balance that is never fully achievable. Internally, there was discussion about thresholds, about what would constitute enough to act, enough to name, enough to move from inquiry to accusation, and those discussions were fraught because the margin for error had narrowed with time, not widened, and the consequences of being wrong were now amplified by decades of scrutiny. The family was consulted more frequently, not for permission, but for perspective, their long view grounding decisions that might otherwise have been driven by impatience, and their responses remained steady, measured, a testament to resilience forged in uncertainty. As the investigation pressed on, a sense of inevitability mingled with doubt, the feeling that something would emerge eventually, not because of brilliance or luck, but because unresolved truths have a way of resurfacing when conditions allow, when the structures that once concealed them erode. That erosion was subtle, visible in changing attitudes, in shifting loyalties, in the way people spoke about the past with less confidence, less insistence on fixed narratives, and that fluidity suggested vulnerability, not necessarily guilt, but openness, a loosening of stories once held rigid. Investigators paid attention to that loosening, recognizing it as a potential opening, a moment when long-held versions of events might finally be questioned by those who had lived them, and those moments, when they occur, are delicate, easily missed or mishandled. The case no longer felt dormant, but it also didn't feel close to resolution. Instead, it occupied a liminal space, active without being decisive, moving without arriving, and that in-between state was taxing, because it demanded sustained attention without the reward of progress. Yet in that state, something important happened, a collective acknowledgement that the disappearance was not just an isolated crime, but a lesson about perception, about systems, about the cost of assumptions, and while lessons do not replace answers, they reshape how future questions are asked. The cold case, once a static artifact of 1996, had become a living inquiry again, not defined solely by what was missing, but by what was being reconsidered, reinterpreted, and reclaimed from the weight of time. And as Part 9 settled into the larger narrative, the case stood not at the edge of resolution, but at the edge of understanding, a quieter, more complex threshold, where clarity might emerge not as a single revelation, but as a gradual, unsettling recognition of how easily a life can vanish when certainty fails and routine is trusted too much. The silence that followed was no longer empty, it was reflective, heavy with implication, as if the case itself were shifting shape once more, preparing for whatever reckoning the next turn would demand. What followed was not a breakthrough, but a reckoning, the kind that arrives when an investigation has stripped away every illusion except one. The belief that resolution must arrive in a single moment, a revelation sharp enough to cut through decades of uncertainty, and letting go of that belief was harder than anyone expected. Investigators began to accept that if the truth surfaced now, it might do so in fragments, incomplete, resistant to narrative, and that acceptance changed how they listened, how they read old files, how they weighed silence against speech, because absence itself can be a form of information if you stop expecting it to behave like evidence. Attention shifted toward what the case had become rather than what it once was, a long accumulation of decisions, delays, interpretations, and omissions, and within that accumulation, patterns emerged not of action, but of inertia, moments when momentum faltered, when urgency softened into routine, and those moments mattered as much as any physical trace ever could. There was renewed scrutiny of institutional memory, how stories are passed down within departments, how early interpretations harden into unofficial doctrine, shaping how future investigators approach a case without ever realizing it. And in this one, that inheritance had been both a guide and a constraint. Detectives spoke candidly now about misgivings they had never voiced publicly, doubts they had carried quietly for years, concerns about paths not taken, questions not pressed hard enough, and those conversations, while uncomfortable, felt necessary, a kind of internal audit of belief. The genealogical DNA effort continued its slow advance, and while it had yet to deliver a name that could withstand legal scrutiny, it had done something else. It had demonstrated that the past was not sealed, that even decades later, connections could still be traced, narrowed, challenged, and that realization alone altered the emotional landscape of the case. Still, investigators understood the limits of science, that even a perfect genetic match would not resurrect lost moments, would not explain decisions made in fear or calculation, would not restore the life that had been interrupted, and that understanding tempered expectations, grounding hope in realism. Externally, the pressure for closure remained relentless, amplified by media cycles that thrive on endings, and investigators found themselves resisting not apathy, but narrative gravity, the pull toward declaring something solved simply to satisfy the demand for resolution, a temptation they knew could not be indulged. The family, long accustomed to waiting, sensed the shift in tone, the quieter language, the more cautious phrasing, and they responded with a familiar steadiness, neither withdrawing nor pressing, their presence a reminder that truth, even partial, mattered more than spectacle. As discussions turned toward future strategy, the question arose of how long an investigation can remain open without becoming symbolic rather than active, and opinions varied, some arguing for continued pursuit at all costs, others advocating for a reframing that acknowledged uncertainty without abandoning responsibility. That debate was not about giving up, but about honesty, about recognizing that some cases do not conclude with clarity, but with understanding, and that understanding, while unsatisfying, can still hold value, can still inform, can still honor what was lost. Investigators revisited the physical spaces again, not to search for evidence, but to recalibrate perspective, to remind themselves that the disappearance was not an abstraction, that it began in ordinary places inhabited by ordinary people, and that grounding exercise reinforced a sobering truth, that extraordinary harm often emerges from ordinary conditions. The house, the street, the routes once traced so carefully, all remained stubbornly unchanged in their essence, and that continuity was unsettling, because it suggested that nothing about the environment had demanded attention, nothing had announced danger, reinforcing the idea that the disappearance had been enabled by normalcy rather than chaos. As Part 10 unfolded, the case felt poised not for resolution, but for transition, a shift from the pursuit of a definitive answer to the preservation of an honest question, one that acknowledged what was known, what was likely, and what might never be recovered. That shift did not feel like defeat, but it did feel like grief, a collective mourning for the certainty that had been lost along with the woman herself, and that grief required space, acknowledgement, a willingness to sit with ambiguity without trying to erase it. Investigators recognized that their role at this stage was as much about stewardship as discovery, ensuring that the case remained accessible, accurate, and alive for whoever might one day hold the missing piece, whether that was another detective, another technology, or another moment of human truth. The cold case, long defined by its silence, had begun to speak in a different register, not loudly, not conclusively, but insistently, asking not for resolution at any cost, but for attention, care, and honesty about the limits of what could be known. And as the investigation settled into this quieter, heavier phase, one reality became impossible to ignore: that the disappearance had altered more than one life. It had reshaped a community's sense of safety, a department's understanding of itself, and an enduring belief that time alone can heal unanswered questions. The case remained open, unresolved, suspended between past and present, and in that suspension, it continued to exert its influence, a reminder that some stories do not end with answers, but with the responsibility to remember, to question, and to resist the comfort of forgetting. The silence at the center of it all persisted, not empty, not passive, but waited, as if holding something just beyond reach, waiting for the moment when it might finally be understood, or when it would simply become part of the permanent, unresolved echo of 1996. There is a moment, near the end of every long investigation, when the noise falls away, when phones stop ringing as often, when briefing rooms empty faster than they used to, and what remains is not an answer but a weight, a quiet pressure that settles into the bones of everyone still standing close enough to feel it. And this case reached that moment without ceremony, without a final press conference, without the clean punctuation of handcuffs closing around wrists. The file never closed, not officially, but it began to breathe differently, like something kept alive by intention rather than momentum, sustained by the refusal to let it vanish into storage. And that refusal itself became an act of defiance against time, against forgetting, against the idea that unresolved means unimportant. Investigators spoke less about suspects now and more about responsibility, about what it means to carry a cold case forward when certainty has evaporated, when every new lead arrives already shadowed by doubt, and yet still demands to be treated as if it might be the one that changes everything. The DNA, so once charged with promise, remained suspended in its ambiguous power, a scientific whisper that hinted at proximity without delivering confession. A reminder that technology can narrow the field but cannot narrate the crime, cannot explain motive, cannot speak for the dead. And the dead or the missing, depending on which language one chooses, remained painfully present in absence, a name spoken carefully, a photograph kept just out of direct light, a life reduced by public memory to a moment of disappearance, even as those who loved her remembered the thousands of moments that came before. The community learned to live with that contradiction, with streets that looked the same but felt altered, with routines that resumed but never fully recovered their innocence, because once a cold case embeds itself into the collective psyche, it does not leave quietly. Children who were not yet born in 1996 grew up hearing fragments of the story, half-whispered warnings, vague references to something that happened once and could happen again. And in that way, the case extended its reach far beyond its original timeline. For law enforcement, the case became a mirror, reflecting both diligence and limitation. A reminder that effort does not guarantee outcome, that good faith work can still end in ambiguity, and that accepting this truth is one of the hardest disciplines of the profession. There were nights when detectives revisited the material alone, not because protocol demanded it, but because silence invites questions that daylight suppresses, and in those quiet hours, they confronted the possibility that the truth might already be present in the file, misread, misunderstood, or simply too ordinary to have been recognized at the time. That possibility lingered like static, impossible to locate precisely, impossible to ignore, and it fueled a particular kind of vigilance, one that does not chase headlines but waits, alert, ready for the smallest deviation from expectation. Tips still arrived, fewer now, but no less earnest, often delivered by people who had carried a detail for years, unsure whether it mattered, unsure whether it was too late, and every one of them was received with the same careful attention, because cold cases survive on the belief that delay does not equal irrelevance. The family continued their vigil, not dramatic, not loud, but unwavering, their endurance reshaping the narrative from one of tragedy alone to one of persistence, a living counterpoint to the silence that defined the case. They understood something the public often does not, that resolution is not a single event, but a spectrum, and that even without final answers, there is meaning in keeping the question alive, in refusing to let the story collapse into a footnote. As years passed, the case adapted, absorbing new frameworks, new technologies, new interpretations, becoming less a static mystery and more a living inquiry, one that evolved alongside those who carried it. Yet for all that evolution, the core remained unchanged, a moment in 1996 when something irreversible occurred, when a life diverged sharply from expectation, leaving behind a vacuum that no amount of analysis could fully fill. That vacuum became the case's true center, not the evidence, not the theories, but the absence itself, the unanswered why, the missing how, the unresolved who, each question circling the others without ever collapsing into certainty. And so the cold case persisted, not as a failure, but as a testament to the limits of knowing, a reminder that some truths resist discovery not because they are unknowable, but because they are fragile, easily obscured by time, by fear, by the ordinary chaos of human behavior. In the end, there was no closing line delivered with authority, no final image to reassure the audience that order had been restored, only a continued watchfulness, a promise implicit rather than spoken, that the case would remain open as long as memory endured. The silence remained, heavy, unresolved, but not empty, holding within it the possibility, however faint, that one day it might fracture, releasing what it had guarded for so long. Until then, the story stayed where it had always been, suspended between what happened and what is known, a cold case not defined by its lack of answers, but by the enduring refusal to stop asking. Time did not bring clarity, but it brought perspective, and perspective can be just as unsettling, because it strips away the illusion that answers are owed simply because questions have been asked long enough, and that realization settled slowly over everyone still tethered to the case, like a cold front moving in without warning. The investigation existed now in a strange dual state, dormant on paper, alive in memory. Its presence felt less in daily briefings and more in the quiet decisions made by those who knew its contours by heart, decisions about what to keep, what to revisit, what never to discard no matter how many years passed. Files were digitized, audio tapes preserved, photographs rescanned at higher resolution, not because anyone expected an immediate breakthrough, but because preservation itself became an act of hope, a belief that someday someone would see what others had missed, hear what once sounded like noise, recognize significance where there had only been ambiguity. The language surrounding the case changed again, subtly, drifting away from the sharp certainty of suspects and toward the careful vocabulary of possibility. And while that shift frustrated some, it also protected the integrity of the truth, preventing speculation from hardening into accusation. Cold case units across the state referenced it quietly, not as a cautionary tale, but as a benchmark, an example of how complexity accumulates, how early assumptions can echo for decades, shaping investigative gravity long after their origins have been forgotten. New detectives were introduced to the file not with urgency, but with reverence, told to read slowly, to resist the urge to solve it in their heads before understanding it in full, because this was not a case that yielded to speed or confidence. Some of them noticed details others had skimmed past, a pause in a transcript, a phrase repeated by different witnesses years apart, a logistical inconsistency so minor it had once seemed irrelevant, and while none of these details cracked the case open, they kept it breathing, kept it responsive to scrutiny. The public narrative, however, continued to drift, simplified by distance, reshaped by retelling, often collapsing the story into a single image or theory, and investigators watched that happen with a mix of resignation and concern, knowing how easily repetition can masquerade as truth. Occasionally, a documentary crew or podcast would circle back, drawn by the gravity of the unresolved, and with each retelling, the same tension emerged, the pull between storytelling and accuracy, between drama and restraint, and those closest to the case guarded the line carefully. They knew the damage that could be done by certainty where none existed, how a single mischaracterized detail could reignite suspicion, reopen wounds, or distort public understanding beyond repair. The family felt those ripples most sharply, absorbing each resurgence of attention with practiced composure, their grief long since transformed into something quieter, but no less profound, a constant presence rather than an acute wound. They had learned to live in parallel timelines, one where the world moved forward, and one where everything still pivoted around that single day in 1996, and navigating between those timelines required a resilience few ever see, let alone understand. There were moments, rare but potent, when a new lead would surface, a call from another state, a name triggered by a genealogical tree, a memory jogged loose by age or regret. And in those moments, the case snapped briefly back into urgency, hearts lifting before caution reasserted itself. More often than not, those leads dissolved under scrutiny, not maliciously, not deceptively, but quietly, collapsing under the weight of verification, leaving behind only the familiar residue of what might have been. And yet, each one reaffirmed a central truth, that silence is not the same as emptiness, that even after decades, the case continued to interact with the present, to provoke movement, however slight. Investigators came to understand that the measure of success here could not be arrest or conviction alone, but fidelity, the commitment to accuracy, to openness, to resisting the erosion of truth by time and convenience. That understanding shaped how the case was spoken about internally, not as a problem to be solved at all costs, but as a responsibility to be honored without compromise. The absence at the center of the story remained unchanged, a void no process could fill, and yet around that void, a structure had formed, made of memory, diligence, and refusal to forget. As the years continued to stack, the case did not fade, it deepened, acquiring layers of meaning beyond the original crime, becoming a reflection of how societies handle uncertainty, how institutions confront limitation, how individuals endure unresolved loss. And in that depth, the cold case found its final uneasy form, not a closed chapter, not an open wound, but a living reminder that some truths do not arrive fully formed, and some stories do not end, they linger, demanding patience, humility, and the courage to keep listening to the silence. By the 13th movement of this long, unbroken vigil, the case had ceased to feel like an investigation and begun to resemble a presence, something that lingered in corridors and conversations, something that followed careers, outlasted promotions, and refused to be confined to a file number or a shelf label. It lived in the way seasoned detectives paused when the year 1996 was mentioned, in the way younger officers lowered their voices when asking about it, as if volume alone might disturb something fragile, something unresolved that still demanded respect. There was an unspoken understanding now that the case would never return to the raw urgency of its early days, that no surge of manpower or media attention could recreate the conditions under which truth first slipped through grasping fingers, and that understanding carried its own kind of mourning. Yet even in this quieter phase, the case continued to exert pressure, subtle but constant, shaping decisions in unrelated investigations, influencing how evidence was handled, how assumptions were challenged, how quickly conclusions were allowed to settle. Supervisors referenced it during training not as a warning, but as a lesson in patience, emphasizing how easily certainty can masquerade as progress, how early confidence can calcify into blind spots that persist for decades. They spoke about the danger of narrative momentum, the human impulse to impose order on chaos, and how that impulse, left unchecked, can bury the very truth it seeks to uncover. Within the archived materials, certain moments gained new resonance, not because they had changed, but because the context around them had, a casual remark now echoing with unintended significance, a timeline discrepancy revealing the fragility of assumptions once treated as fact. These reinterpretations did not rewrite the story, but they softened its edges, replacing sharp accusations with gradients of possibility, and that shift altered how guilt and innocence were discussed, more carefully, more cautiously, with an awareness of the harm that certainty can inflict when it outpaces proof. The DNA profile, still unresolved in its implications, became almost symbolic, a molecular ghost hovering at the margins of the narrative, promising proximity without clarity, presence without explanation. It reminded investigators that even the most advanced tools cannot compel the past to speak plainly, that science can illuminate pathways without dictating destinations. Outside the department, the case continued to surface in unexpected ways, in online forums, in late-night conversations, in amateur timelines stitched together with conviction and conjecture, each iteration reflecting a public hunger not just for answers, but for meaning. Some theories gained traction not because they were strong, but because they were simple, offering emotional closure in place of factual resolution, and those theories traveled faster than nuance ever could. Investigators monitored these currents quietly, aware of their influence, wary of their distortions, and committed to maintaining a boundary between speculation and evidence, even as that boundary grew harder to defend in an age of instant narrative. The family, ever present, ever restrained, navigated these waves with a practiced calm, choosing when to engage and when to withdraw, protecting what remained of their private grief while allowing the case to exist in public memory. They understood that the story no longer belonged solely to them, nor solely to law enforcement, but to a shared space shaped by loss, curiosity, and the unresolved tension between them. There were moments of doubt, voiced only in private, questions about whether continuing to engage prolonged the pain, whether hope itself had become a burden, and those questions were met not with answers, but with acceptance. Acceptance did not mean surrender. It meant recognizing that endurance takes many forms, and that sometimes persistence looks like stillness rather than pursuit. As the years continued to stretch, the case took on a kind of moral weight, a reminder that not all harm is followed by justice, that not all stories resolve neatly, and that society must still account for those truths without turning away. That weight pressed hardest on those who had inherited the case without inheriting its beginnings, detectives tasked not with solving a crime, but with safeguarding its integrity, ensuring that whatever truth remained was not lost to neglect or distortion. They approached the file with humility, aware that they were custodians rather than authors, responsible not for rewriting the past, but for preserving its questions intact. In that role, the case continued, not loudly, not dramatically, but persistently, a steady pulse beneath the surface of institutional memory, refusing to fade, refusing to be simplified. And as Part 13 drew to its close, the cold case stood exactly where it had for years, unresolved, unyielding, suspended between what is known and what is suspected, its power lying not in answers delivered, but in the quiet, enduring demand to keep looking, to keep questioning, to keep faith with the unknown.